So today we're going to be talking about adding custom gear to our units in our mission that we are making, and we do this by using the initplayer local.sqf event script. The reason why we use this script is because this script is only run once when the player connects, and is run locally on the player, rather than if you were to say put these chunks of code into the player's init box, it would run every single time a JIT player would join, and thereby executing multiple times during the mission. So starting off inside the script, I'll explain it piece by piece like I've done with every other script. At the top we'll have our private variable array, which states all the local variables so that they can only be used in the script and nowhere else. Next I will declare my vest array, which is basically all the vests that I want to have a chance that the units will spawn with. After that, I have the uniform array, which is the uniform the units will spawn with. And then the headgear array, which is all the headgear that's possible to spawn on the unit. And then the glasses array, which again is all the glasses that could spawn on a unit. So as you can see, I already have these arrays all filled in. What I did to get these class names was basically I went into the editor, I went into Virtual Arsenal, and I grabbed the uniform that I wanted, the vest that I wanted, and the helmet and glasses, and then I just exported that. So it'll export to your clipboard, which you can then come into the editor and you just basically hit File, New, and then Control V, paste what is in your clipboard into there, and you can grab the class names out of there and construct your own arrays for your own uniforms. And from there, I go into grabbing the player's class name with the format command and the type of command. What this is saying is the type of player, so the class name of the player, is then being assigned to a string that is designated by %1. So in the string, in the variable, is the class name of the player. After that, I go into and I remove all the player's gear. I sleep for 2 seconds to let it catch up, and then I go into a switch statement. A switch statement is basically just a bunch of if statements where it goes, if something is true for this case, then do this section of code. So what this switch statement is saying is basically in the case that the string that we grabbed is the same as the class name of the player, so same as the pilot, then we will run this portion of the code, and only that portion of the code. In the event that a string is not matched by the case, it comes down and it executes the default statement, which is this right here. So anytime any of those cases aren't matched, it'll execute this default chunk of code. And this is why I use a switch statement rather than just a bunch of if statements. So now to break down each segment of code. So starting off with this first condition, I have if it is a pilot, I'm going to assign it a pilot loadout. So I'm going to give them a pilot uniform for the G-forces. I'm going to add a night vision to their uniform. And then from here I'm adding some bandages, I'm adding morphine, and then I'm also adding some mags. And then I give them a parachute, I give them a headgear as a jet pilot, so they look like a pilot, and then I give them a weapon. It's important to note that when you're adding weapons to players, that you need to add the magazine that the weapon uses before you add the weapon. This is to have the weapon automatically loaded in the player. Otherwise, the weapon will not be loaded if you add the magazines after. The next segment I go into is linking the items. So here I link the item map, the compass, and all the standard gear into the standard slots, so that the player will have an item map, an item compass, a micro dagger, and a GPS. It is important to note that the link item will only be seen on a dedicated server, so when you go into practice, or when you go into preview with your mission, you won't see these items actually being initialized. So that is the pilot case. So let's say we have a team leader case. So here is where I do a little bit of randomization to add a little bit of diversity, where you could just select one uniform and add it. I choose, like I said, to select it from a random array, so I don't know what the player is going to be getting. So I'm selecting a random vest, a random uniform, which because we only have one uniform, it selects that one. I select a random headgear and a random glasses. And then I take those strings and I add it to the player. So I give them the uniform, I give them the vest, the headgear, and the glasses. And then from here I go into the type of backpack I want to get them. Now this is really up to the player to decide, or not the player, the mission maker to decide. Normally I only assign assault packs or lightweight gear because the player eventually is going to end up changing gear. Basically, these loadouts are temporary loadouts to use in missions where, let's say, you're in an ambush and you don't have time to go to a box to rearm and get your actual gear. So here again, I'm doing a for loop. So for 1 to 9 times, I'm going to add a field dressing or a bandage. So that means I'm adding 9 bandages to the uniform of the player. Again, you'll notice that I add the magazines before I add the weapon, and then here I come down and I add the weapon, along with the weapon sights and the weapon items. And then again, I go into linking the items, so I link a UAV terminal, I link a radio, and I link Ace Wide night vision goggles. Again, these sort of items will vary from person to person depending on what slot they're in. So as a marksman, I'll give them a marksman scope. If they're auto rifleman, I'll give them an auto rifleman sight / magazine count. It's always good to test each individual slot too before you actually put the mission up, because it should show you that there might be something missing. So now we'll talk about requirements for slots. It is my recommendation that you don't assume players won't use items. Some of the mistakes I've seen other mission makers make is that when they're adding custom gear to units is that sometimes they'll leave out giving a secondary weapon to a player because they think players won't use their secondary. That's not always the best logic to follow because you don't know what the player is going to use. Sometimes they will want to use their secondary if they want to pick up another person's gun or if they run out of ammo. Let's say you don't give them binos because you don't think they're going to use binos. Well, there's going to be that time in the mission where they're going to want to pull out binos and they're going to realize they don't have any. So as a mission maker, you should never assume that players aren't going to use stuff. It's better to add stuff in and let the player drop it if they don't want it or not use it than to just not give it to them to begin with. Now, this isn't saying that if you want to restrict binos from players, by all means, go ahead and do that. Now, on a final note, I'll go over some things that I talked about during this tutorial on scripting custom gear. One thing I want to clarify with the link item, what that command is actually doing is it's taking that item and it's putting it in the slot where it should be. So in the example of night vision, instead of putting it inside a vest or backpack, it's actually going to put it in the night vision slot, so it will be on the player. The other command I want to clarify is the force add uniform. This is the proper command that you should use all the time because there might be cases where if your player is an East unit and you want to add a Blue 4 uniform to them, to say they're undercover or whatnot, you will need to use this force add uniform, otherwise they will appear naked. And that about wraps up this tutorial on adding custom gear to units in your mission.